Well, here we are, folks. Another Tuesday evening. Welcome, welcome. Hope everybody is fine. Nice to see everybody in the chat. Some good comments already about is Jim, looking in desperation to try and find some more taxes? Is it because the inflation's high? What's going on? What about AI? Lots of interesting conversations. Put the pre-show on just for a moment. Not quite at 8 o'clock yet. Hope everybody is well this evening. As normal, we're all set up here. The studio's working properly tonight. Leith is there. Remember that last time I tried to get Leith on live, we had a bit of a problem. The computer died. But anyway, it's now repaired and working fine. And the doggies are here as well. And hopefully they'll be relaxed and just stay put. They've had their feed. They've been taken for their walk. So hopefully everything will be fine. And we're just counting down now to the 8 p.m. start. I always like to start on time. There we go. Just ticked over. So I'll take the pre-show off. I'll start the main show. Be back in just a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to the live stream on the 28th of April 2026. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. Thanks for taking time out of your Tuesday to spend it with us. Really appreciate it. Very important conversation, as always, tonight, this time with Leith, and I'll bring him in just a moment. Just before I do that, remind you, of course, that we're not providing specific financial or legal or property advice. This is a general conversation only. This is as at the 28th of April if you're watching in replay. And if you'd like to ask a question live on the show, which of course I encourage, and we'll try and make sure that we remind you later as well to throw any questions in, use that What the World DFA to get my attention. I've enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get your question to the top of the list, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Really appreciate those who support us via the Super Chat, via PayPal, or even Patreon. Really appreciate it. Helps us to keep going. Don't do this for profit. We do this because there's a really, really important conversation to be had. And frankly, with what's going on at the moment, probably never more important. Right, let me bring Leith straight in. Leith, welcome back. Lovely to see you again. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Martin. Thanks for having me on again. It's definitely a good time to be to talk about through all these issues. We've got the federal budget coming up. We've got obviously on the cusp of probably another rate rise early next month. Everything's happening.
It is everything happening a bit. And it's interesting if you think about it. We've got the RBA decision next Tuesday. We've got the budget after that. We've got the unknown unknowns in the Middle East and the implications of that, not just in the immediate, next few weeks. We don't know whether it's going to continue or not. But even the overhang, and there was an interesting comment from a politician in the UK who said that even when the straits get open again, whenever that is, it's going to be 8 to 12 months before they see the inflation come down and things start to reopen. So this is a long-term crisis. And the reason I called this show what I called it was because, well, it's interesting how everybody in the property media has now started worrying about property price falls. There's been a whole spate of different a different commentary about the fact that prices could be easing in it. So what I want to do tonight, Leith, is to talk about the perfect property storm. Is it coming? What does it mean? What's the real data telling us? And frankly, what are the implications for Jim and the budget and for the Australian economy? And I think more broadly, I would argue that a lot of the issues that we're facing into at the moment, apart from the Trump issue directly, is to do with bad policies that's been happened over the last 20, 30, 40 years. But I'm not sure we're going to see any change positive. So this is a really important conversation, important time to have the conversation. And we're going to try and also, towards the end of the show in particular, suggest some of the levers that should be pulled perhaps in a different way in the budget that would actually make a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we are facing a perfect storm. We've got obviously rising interest rates. We've got rising energy prices, which in Australia's case, I've got some charts for later maybe, but we are the most diesel dependent economy in the advanced world. And we're still facing the potential of having, extreme diesel shortages, which could literally shutter the economy alongside, problems with fertilizer and that sort of stuff. We're sort of in a bit of a fool's paradise right now. So driving around Australia at the moment, petrol prices and even diesel have come down quite a bit. So, I filled up one of my cars, only half a tank. I don't let them get particularly low a couple of days ago. And I filled up with a 6 cent discount at 7-Eleven. I think I paid $1.70 for unleaded, which is basically almost normal price, right? So, the prices have come off a bit. Even diesel's down to $2.50, but I think it's sort of the calm before the storm. Obviously, we've got the 26 cent a litre excise cut from the federal government, which has artificially lowered it. And then also we've had this sort of temporary reprieve with prices. The global oil price fell for a bit, on the hopes that this war in the Middle East was over, but I don't think it is over at all. And if anything, I think it's probably going to, ramp back up. And as you said in the intro, even if it did magically end, say, next week, it's going to take months to restart all this stuff, because you got all the ships in the strait that have just been stranded, which will then have to get to their destinations. A lot of the oil fields have been damaged. A lot of the infrastructure around the oil fields and the refineries have been damaged in the Middle East, so they'll have to be repaired. Some of the oil fields are basically being shut. You can't just turn them back on again. You got to restart that, which takes a long time. So, we are looking at a pretty, sort of long tail with this sort of stuff where even if the strait opens up, it could be another 6 months before we sort of resume normal sort of oil flows. So there is going to be a bit of a long tail to this. And it's another case of, how long is a piece of string? We really don't know.
Well, if I was trying to do the budget in a few weeks' time, I could give you a few different scenarios. One is the war might end quick. The other is the war might go on for 6 months, 12 months. I mean, those would give you a huge aperture difference, wouldn't it, in terms of the implications for trying to put budget numbers together. People, the IMF, for example, are talking about recession, stagflation. They're talking about higher interest rates. And the RBA they've already been signaling very strongly about future interest rates will need to be higher because the inflation rates are. They stuffed up, didn't they? They didn't take rates high enough soon enough in Australia to try and quell inflation before all of this happened. So the forward view to the end of the year is what, 4.7% cash rate, according to the markets. Now the markets are just an indicator, but it gives you a sense. So probably they'll raise rates. But on the other hand, they're going to be nervous, really, really nervous, because what is the engine that's holding the economy together, other than the resource sector, which may be going off the boil a little, is the housing sector. And if you look at how much of the Australian economy is just welded to housing through mortgages, through building and construction and everything else, if that starts to go pear-shaped, if indeed prices go down, financial stability could be at risk too. So they are really caught between, I need to put rates up because of inflation, but if I do, I'm going to actually potentially, some financial instability. So, yeah, the RBA is trying to dig itself out of a hole, and I'm not sure they've necessarily got all the tools that they'd need to have to be able to do that. And the implications for people, I think, could be quite difficult.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I do have a tiny bit of sympathy for the RBA because they only have one tool, and they're trying to obviously balance inflation with full employment. But unfortunately, I as usual, I put most of the blame on this inflation issue, on the predicament we're in, not on the RBA, but on the government. So the federal government basically has a whole bunch of tools with, fiscal, immigration policy, all sorts of stuff, housing policy, what have you. They have loads of tools at their disposal, and they refuse to do anything useful with any of it. Like, obviously tax policy, all these sorts of things. So really the federal government, and this isn't just this government, this is previous governments, really the last governments for the last 20 years pretty much, have basically outsourced macroeconomic management to the RBA through one tool, which is interest rates, which is pretty ridiculous, really. And, the RBA is facing they're in a pretty bad position. Obviously, we've got this structurally high inflation, both domestic pressures before this happened, before this global energy shock, but now they've got these international, cost push inflation manifesting as well. At the same time as they must be worried about unemployment rising. I know the unemployment rate at the moment was at 4.3% is good historically, but it's got a very weak underbelly because most of the jobs in the last several years have been government-funded jobs in the non-market sector. Also, obviously with rates going up, the potential for a fair bit of economic carnage from not so much higher fuel prices, that's a problem, but it's more potential fuel shortages in the diesel area, particularly, could send a lot of people unemployed. But also we've got the prospect of an AI jobs shock as well, which is going to manifest in the next few years. So there was a survey, I think, by Mercer of HR professionals and senior management across Australian companies, and basically 100% of those surveyed in those companies thought that they're going to lay off staff because of AI in the next 2 years. And Tim Toohey from Yarra Capital, he's the chief economist there. He did some analysis. I think he tipped that the unemployment rate, this was his sort of baseline forecast, was the unemployment rate could rise to 6% in the next 2 years because of the AI shock. And he had a sort of more aggressive forecast, which was significantly higher than that, if it's worse than they think. So the RBA is going to be grappling with concerns about rising unemployment, but at the same time they've got rising inflation as well, so high inflation. So they're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place and in a no-win situation. And really, I wouldn't want to be in their situation because they can't sort of win either way. And really, they need the federal government and policymakers to help them out. That's the bottom issue here.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of those policy issues. Now, of course, we had Chalmers coming out and saying, well, we're going to actually skinny back down the NDIS because, of course, that cost blowout has been ridiculously, 10% or something, right? Year on year on year. I feel a bit concerned about those people who may have been caught in the crossfire here because, of course, more and more people have been funneled towards NDIS. The states are saying, hold on a moment, you're going to throw people back at us and we don't have the money to provide alternative services. So there could be people who actually are receiving services they won't get anymore. But I would argue that also the management of the NDIS has been a major issue. There are a lot of evidence of firms exploiting the NDS and charging a lot of money to provide services to people who need those services possibly. But there's an issue there. There's also the question, of course, about changes to the tax system, particularly around the capital gains tax and maybe negative gearing for property and the implications of that. And we'd also highlight probably more needing to spend on defence, particularly now with everything that's going on. And that's clearly in there. The AUKUS thing is going to probably blow out and require even a bigger spend, although I've still got some scepticism about whether AUKUS will ever deliver us anything, whether it be a submarine or not. And the other point in the budget, when you look closely, there are more and more tricks being used by the Treasury to hide stuff away from the normal budget through capital spend or through, off-balance sheet things. So the true state of the budget is probably a lot worse than the numbers when they sort of present them at budget night.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris Richardson, who he used to be one of the heads of Deloitte, Access Economics, and he's actually gone out on his own. He's got his own consultancy called Rich Economics. Rich Insights, I think it's called. And look, he's probably like Australia's best budget analyst. Like he's just been doing the budget for his whole life, and he understands this stuff better than most. And he's been doing some great work on Twitter where he's basically showed the extent to which the federal government is hiding its deficits. So just to give a little bit of background, back in the mid 2000s, the former Howard Costello government. So the federal budget used to be reported on a headline basis. So what the headline basis is basically just cash in, cash out, right? That's in the simplest form. But then when the federal government did privatisations, they sold the CBA. That was under Labor, the former government, the Paul Keating government. But then they sold the Telstra. They did the privatisation of Telstra. The federal government got a whole bunch of block of money in, right? So what Peter Costello did at the time is he then came up with a new measurement system to basically exclude those lumpy capital expenditure receipts, and he called it the underlying balance. And the underlying balance is basically the day-to-day cost of running government, so excluding these capital inflows or outflows. And that was basically became the de facto headline measure. Well, I shouldn't say headline because there's another measure called the headline, which is what they used to look at. But that became the measure that all budget analysts looked at. So it's a little bit like looking at headline GDP. And so the underlying balance became basically the gospel for the budget. The problem with it is in the era of deficits that we've got now, focusing on the day-to-day government expenditure is not as relevant, because what's happened is we've got the federal government has basically been doing all these hiding a whole bunch of expenditures off balance sheet. So they call them capital expenditures when they're not necessarily. So, things like student debt forgiveness and, for the HEX debts and, expenditure like government loans, government, all sorts of things. There's the Snowy Hydro scheme, for example. The cost of that's blown out to 42 billion. It was expected to be 2 billion when Malcolm Turnbull announced it all those years ago. You've got all the hidden subsidies for the renewable energy, all that sort of stuff. That's all been pushed off balance sheet. So we've got this, the true measure, which is the measure that everyone should be looking at now, is the headline balance, which is the old one that they used to use. And I've got a chart here from Chris Richardson. It's not the one on the left. So basically, the underlying deficit is the far left bar. The headline deficit's the one in the middle, and then there's a third one, which is called the fiscal deficit, which is basically so the underlying balance is your day-to-day government spending, right? So ignoring your capital loans and the stuff that's off balance sheet. The headline balance is basically the underlying balance plus the off balance sheet stuff. And then Chris Richardson's got another one called the fiscal deficit, which is basically the headline balance plus things like debt forgiveness for HEX debts and things like that. But you'll notice if you look at that chart, the actual true cash deficit for the government, which is this fiscal balance, is double the underlying balance. And it's all very confusing. And there's also a chart from the AFR, which is also from Chris Richardson, which compares the underlying deficit just to the headline deficit. So that's the middle bar to the one on the left. And you can see that over the years, the gap between the two is just blown out. And so effectively what the government's been doing is it's been hiding a lot of expenditures off balance sheet through these special vehicles, through all sorts of things to basically get it off that so they can report a smaller underlying deficit. But really, the thing that we care about is basically cash in, cash out, because we've still got to pay for all this stuff, right? And so Chris Richardson and others are now, and Sol Estlake, for example, are now doing a push to basically get everyone to focus back on the headline deficit, which is the way it used to be done before Costello changed it. But when Costello changed it, he actually changed it for the right reasons, because the government was receiving all this lumpy money from these asset sales, etc. So I wanted to exclude that from the analysis. But now the money's going the other way. The government's paying all this stuff out in all these special vehicles, into renewable subsidies and all this stuff that's all opaque. And the government wants us to focus on the day-to-day costs without that stuff. So, it's all very interesting. And just to your point on the NDIS, the federal government in this budget, they want to basically slow the NDIS expenditure. So there's a chart here on the right from Justin Farbo to Anipati and Macro, and it shows basically the annual growth in the NDIS in those orange bars. You can see it's been running at super high rates. So the latest figure was over 15%. The government wants to slow that over the next 4 years to 2030 to 2% per annum. So that's that bottom blue line. You can see how much of a change that is. And then from 2030, it wants to basically have the NDIS growing at 5%. Now that, to me, if you just look at that chart on the right from Justin Farbo, that looks pretty damn unrealistic that they're going to do that. That they're actually going to achieve it. But I do support them at least trying. The other thing about it is it's kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? So even if they could magically lower the NDIS to those measures, those figures, they're really just pushing some of the expenditure around. So yes, the NDIS may shrink in cost, but they're going to push some of those costs onto other programs, whether it's state-run programs or other stuff. So the expenditure in those areas is going to go up, but that won't be shown because all they're focusing on is NDIS. So it won't necessarily mean that us as taxpayers have to fund less expenditure. Like there will be some less expenditure, but some of that expenditure will just go to other programs. Right. So it's not necessarily going to be, even if they could magically achieve what's in that chart on the right, and also the chart on the left. The chart on the left shows the forecast expenditure versus the status quo. So the old forecast is the status quo if they do nothing, and the new forecast is what the expenditure will be if they achieve what they want to achieve. But even if they did magically achieve that new forecast, it doesn't necessarily mean that total government expenditure goes down by that, because it'll just be some of that will just go into other programs, which are outside the NDIS. So anyway, but it's an interesting situation we've got here. I do at least commend the government for trying to curb the NDIS, because it is unsustainable. Like, it's just ridiculous how much it's grown. But a lot of this does come down to very poor design when the Rudd Gillard government actually designed this. And one of the heads of one of the disability services, I just can't remember his name or where it was from, but he wrote in the AFR last year, I think it was, that he estimated that about 20% of funding in the NDIS is actually rorted. So I think his figure was was 10 billion, but that was 10 billion off, say, 50 billion of expenditure. So that's basically 20%. So $1 in $5 on the NDIS, according to this guy, was basically being rorted somehow. And that just gets down to very poor policy design, right? So they designed this thing to be rorted, unfortunately, or to make it very easy to rort. And that's basically the genesis of the problem we've got here. And that's the main reason why the NDIS has grown so much faster than the government or the Productivity Commission or anybody else ever expected, because it was set up badly in the first place, unfortunately. And, trying to unscramble the egg is very difficult when you set up these systems, because they get legs. People get their snouts in the trough. They set up systems to do it, whatever. And it's very hard to just then unscramble the egg. And it sort of does. It's a canary in the coal mine of why governments, when they set up these things, they need to be very careful that they do it properly, because we've seen this not just across the NDIS. We saw it with pink bats, childcare subsidies, all these sorts of programs. They end up being honeypots for scammers, unfortunately. And what's the old saying? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Unfortunately, the NDIS has become that in a large degree. So the government meant well, and it's a policy that. It's a program that does mean well and does a lot of good to a lot of people, but unfortunately the way they're set up poorly, so it's getting ruthlessly rorted, and the cost of it is just blowing out above what Australia can possibly afford.
Well, I think you could also say exactly the same quote you've just made to the housing support that the government's provided over the last 20, 30, 40 years, and others, and others, and others. I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. No, actually, maybe not. And by the way, just to sort of contextualize the cost of this, right? One of the things to always think about is, well, what is the actual costs? Because they're going to have to issue more bonds. If they issue more bonds, well, the bond market, this is the latest on the 10-year, the Aussie 10-year, the bond market now above 5%, right? That means that the cost of the debt that is going to be incurred because of the government's spending patterns is going to cost the government more and more. And in fact, the truth is that in some countries now, there is more being paid on servicing the existing debt than on even defence or social programs. So you can see how this compounds into a pretty disastrous situation. Now, I know there are people on the NDIS who rightly should get help, no doubt about that. But I also think that because of the way that some of the programs were designed and the lack of real supervision of some of the things that were going on, it's probably true to say that there are some people who've got perhaps more than they really should have under it. But trying then to sort of retrofit a reduction, which is, as you say, dramatic, by changing some of the rules, maybe, pushing more back to the states and say, well, they're less serious cases, so states, you look after them. But of course, that means the states' budgets are going to have to go up. So it's just moving money between federal and state. Remember, the budget is only the federal budget. Just look at Victoria. I'm sure Victoria has plenty of capacity to shell out for more support. And the other interesting observation, if you look at some of the youngsters who are now within NDIS, the proportion of those youngsters getting help has never been higher. Now, is that truly because there is just more issues that need to be solved for young people these days? Or has the definition been changed? Or is something else going on? I don't know. But there's a really important social aspect to this, because, of course, if people get onto these schemes early in life, all the history says it's very hard to get them off again later. So you're laying not just an immediate issue, but also an intergenerational issue into the future too.
Yeah, and I can't remember what the exact stat is. So, if I say the wrong thing, I think I'm going to be around about right. But there was a stat came out that like 1 in 5 boys or something, might have been, or maybe it was 1 in 10, but some absurdly large number of boys aged between like 5 and 8 or something. I'm going to be off, right? So don't. This isn't a literal quote.
Yeah.
Are on the end. Have got autism or something. There's some absurd figure like that came out, and that's just mind-boggling when when you think about it, because there's just no way that that's actually true. Or if they do, they got very mild stuff. So, when I was at school in the 80s and 90s, there's always a few kids who were a bit different, right? But they didn't need NDIS sort of money. They were either quiet, they were introverted or whatever, but they still got through school and they were fine and catch up in the 20. I just went to my 30-year reunion. The same guys are there, and they're fine. They got jobs and all that sort of stuff. They're just a bit different, right? But nowadays, if you're a little bit different, suddenly, a lot of people get put on the NDIS. It's just ridiculous. Or they get put on some sort of, I don't know, drug or something like that. It's just, I think we overdo things these days. And there are obviously people that are severely disabled and need it. And look, full transparency. My son's on the NDIS. He's severely autistic, so he's non-verbal. He's just turned 18 in March, and I've never had a conversation with him because he's disabled, right? He'll never drive a car. He needs 24-hour care basically, right? So he's not, he can go to the toilet himself and stuff like that, but we can't leave him alone. And we haven't been able to, and I don't think we ever will be able to leave him alone. So, he is on the NDIS, but that's obviously a different case to people who are just a little bit different. They can talk and they go to mainstream schools and that sort of stuff. And I think we've got sort of too many people who are, just a little bit different, I guess, who are on the NDIS when they probably shouldn't be. And that's one of the reasons why the cost is blown out. Like the figures of, I think there's something like 900,000 people are on there, or some ridiculous thing. The government wants to get it down to like 600,000. But it was some absurd number of people are on the NDIS. And you just think that figure just doesn't pass the pub test.
No, I think it does ask some really important questions about definitional. And they're talking now about not just based on a diagnosis, but on functional capability. But of course, that means that people are going to have to go through tests. So there's a bunch of implication issues. But the broader point, Leith, is one, if you have a program that is actually designed in a particular way to grow at a particular rate, and then it grows at 5 or 6 times that rate, you'd have thought earlier on in the process, you might have asked some questions about why is it going off the rails? I mean, it was obvious years ago that this was going off the rails, and there were only minor tweaks. And two, the question is, what is the scope and limit of government intervention? And, is everything, when it goes wrong, the government's fault? And, do we continue just to look for the government? Will the government solve the housing crisis? Will the government solve the oil crisis? Oh, well, they've given you a tax cut on the oil thing, right? And they're running around the world trying to get more tankers to come into Australia because we've got gas to trade. So there's an interesting question in my mind about, do we have an over-egged expectation of the government's going to fix everything for us? Or to turn it another way, is it actually the case that it's less and less capable for people to sort of make their own way and make their own decisions, and are just looking more and more towards the government to solve everything for us? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly, if you look at the job growth numbers, etc., the government is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the economy. And it used to be when I was growing up, or even in the 90s, right, when I was a young adult, the government was like it was a mostly private sector driven economy, with the government just being the add-on. Being around the edges, whatever. But now it's like the government is the driver. So it's the driver of economic activity. It's become a lot more interventionist as well, and it is driving most of the job growth now. So most people now in Australia are getting paid by the government one way or another. Or so I shouldn't say most, but a very large chunk, and a much larger than it used to be, chunk now, and the government's basically just becoming a more and more, a bigger player in the economy now. And that's showing with deplorable productivity. Like, Australia's productivity growth is absolutely deplorable now. And part of the reason for that is that we have this massive expansion in the state. The non-market sector has just grown so big. And there isn't a lot of discipline in those areas. They're also often in areas which are very hard to get a higher productivity growth because they're services based, etc. And it's really having a detrimental impact on the economy.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, the money that the government is spending is our money. That means that effectively it has to be recovered in some way. And as you know, and I know, the proportion of the tax take from households and individuals, as well as through the GST, rises. The tax take from the corporate sector continues to fall. And you sometimes wonder whether, in fact, the government really is more supporting corporates than actually individuals, and are using the individuals and households as, if you like, the last post standing. Well, where are we going to find some more money? Well, let's look at the budget, right? Well, okay, CGT on the investment properties and negative gearing changes and changes to the superannuation system and all those things. So what's fascinating to me is that two things. A lot of people expect the government to do more, first, and second, expect somebody else to pay. Except at the end of the day, it's only households that actually stand at the end of the chain, don't they?
Yeah. And look, let's be honest. The fastest growing area of tax revenue is personal income taxes. It's the biggest growth area. It is the biggest contributor now to taxes. We are one of the most personal income tax reliant economies on the planet, and it is the fastest growing area of so every year the government, without doing anything, gets more personal income tax, right? Because of bracket creep. So every year we have inflation, especially at the moment we've got high inflation. We get some wage growth to compensate for that inflation. Doesn't mean often you're going backwards though, because it still doesn't compensate enough. And the government and your average tax rate goes up because people get pushed into higher tax brackets, and the government collects more revenue. And then at the same time, and unfortunately, the massive reliance on personal income taxes is one of the reasons why the federal government loves high immigration, because it can basically import hundreds of thousands of people every year. Most of those people are going to work, and it's an easy way for the federal government to raise tax revenue. But unfortunately, the cost of that high immigration then gets deferred on the states, who then have to provide the infrastructure and the services and that sort of thing. That's part of the reason why, especially in Victoria and New South Wales, we don't have as much resource base to rely on. They're drowning in debt, and in some other states as well, drowning in debt. And at the same time, other areas of taxation are shrinking as a share of the economy. So obviously, because of the rise of electric vehicles, et cetera, which the government is massively subsidising as well, they're getting less fuel excise. They've completely stuffed up tobacco, taxation. So they lifted tobacco taxes so high that they're actually getting less tax take because everyone's buying illegal stuff. So they're losing tax revenue there. So excise revenue in general is shrinking. The GST never grows as fast as the economy or expenditure, because there's about 50% of expenditure is not taxed, because it's health, education, financial services, a whole bunch of other stuff isn't taxed. So the GST never keeps up. Basically, all the other areas of taxation in the economy, and because we don't tax resources properly as well, we don't get enough tax out of that. So the one area where the government is becoming more and more reliant on every year is personal income taxes, which means we just end up getting slugged more. And then also means the federal government is therefore incentivized to run a high migration policy, because that's the easiest way to grow taxes, because you just get more personal income taxes. And the cost of that immigration is deferred on other people, on other areas of the economy. The states, on private citizens through extra toll roads and everything. You got to build user pay fees, that sort of stuff. You have to build to keep up with the immigration. So the equation's not great. And what we really need is for the Henry Tax Review to basically be dusted off, updated, and for the government to actually implement those sorts of things. Because we really do need to broaden the tax base, right? Like make it less reliant on income taxes and more reliant on consumption, land taxes, and resource taxes, and those sorts of things. So don't tax productive effort as much, and tax all the other stuff more. That'd be a much fairer system. And unfortunately, we don't do that. We tax productive effort very hard, and we undertax all those other things. And as a result, we've got the problems we've got.
Yeah, I don't know whether you saw Ken Henry in front of the Senate inquiry into the
About the gas tax.
But basically, he basically came out and said, "Just do it."
Just do it. He goes, cut the crap.
Exactly.
Is basically what he said. Cut the crap and do it in the national interest. And it's just like, well, it's a no-brainer. I mean, I've said it over and over again. We should be one of the richest countries on earth because of the resource endowment that we've got. But we don't tax any of this stuff properly. So the citizens don't get the benefit that we should get. We still get some benefit, don't get me wrong. We get corporate taxes and some of the states get some royalties, etc. So we do get benefit from it, but we don't get nearly as much as we should get. And, as a result, we're always starved for cash. And it's just, it is absolutely crazy. And then at the same time, the government then dilutes our mineral endowment by running a very high immigration policy, which grows the population incredibly, quickly. So therefore, you're spreading your resource endowment over more people, which then makes you poorer as well. So we do everything backwards in Australia. Like, it's just completely backwards of what we should do. And I've said this before, Martin, Norway is the counterfactual to us. Now, we can never do as much as what Norway does because we don't have our resource companies aren't publicly owned, but we could go some of the way there, or Qatar. But Norway, it's oil and gas. Its oil and gas industry is mostly government owned. They do have some private players, but they tax the private players hard. And they basically have made all this money from their oil and gas exports, which they then have funneled into a sovereign wealth fund, which then invests overseas. And now Norwegians are sitting on a sovereign wealth fund that invests in Microsoft and all these other companies. They're the biggest shareholders of Microsoft in the world. And it's worth like $300,000 US per resident. And I know it's got like 5.5 million people. And they're sitting on this sovereign wealth fund that's worth like 300,000 US per resident. Now, because it's worth $300,000 per resident, they have a direct incentive not to run a high immigration policy. Because if they were to say double Norway's population to 11 million people, well, the sovereign wealth fund would be worth 150,000 a head, not 300,000 a head. So it makes them poorer. But us in Australia, we don't tax our resources as much as we should, but then we also run a very high immigration program. And as a result, our mineral exports and the extra company tax we get from our mining sector gets diluted amongst more people through immigration, who then end up just living in the cities and don't actually generate any export revenue. So we do everything back to front here. Like I've said this before, I think Australia would be a far richer country if we had 20 million people than we do at 28 million. Because we'd still have all the same exports. We'd sell the same amount of iron ore, coal, natural gas, etc., and our agriculture would all be the same. Like, the people who live in the cities don't live in the regions, right? The regions is what generates 80% of Australia's exports. And if you took out bogus international education, it's probably more like 90%. But almost all of Australia's exports come from the regions, which aren't really growing much in population. They don't get much immigration. They get bugger all. Instead, we grow the cities like science experiments, who don't actually generate anything in terms of foreign income. Like, okay, international education, if you want to count that, but half of that's bogus. And they don't generate, but they buy heaps of imports through, flat screen TVs, computers, whatever, imported goods, whatever. So we've just got this dumb economy that basically just grows the capital cities, which are pretty non-productive, really. When Australia, whether you like it or not, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but this is what it is. Australia pays its way in the world by selling off its fixed mineral endowment and its agriculture. That is what earns the bulk of Australia's exports. Like, we're talking 80% plus of Australia's exports comes from the regions through agricultural, mining, etc. So what sense does it make to then grow the population aggressively through immigration, which then all lives in the capital cities, when doesn't actually generate you any extra wealth? It's just, we have an upside down economy here. It makes no sense. And the counterfactual, I know it's not a perfect example because we don't tax the stuff like Norway does, but Norway taxes its resources properly, and then it doesn't run a high immigration program, so that bounty from its resources gets spread amongst less people. We don't tax our resources properly. We do get some taxes through corporate taxes and some state royalties, but then we grow the population aggressively, so then the benefit we do get gets diluted amongst more people. So we get less per capita. It makes no sense.
Trying to make sense of the Australian economy and the policies is quite complicated, which is probably a good reason why we have to have these shows, to try and actually cast a bit of a better light on it so that people understand what's really going on. And just to be clear, the housing situation and migration are intrinsically interlinked, right? And if you think about, we started the show by saying, well, everyone's talking about a housing crisis and prices could crash, and we'll get into that further as we go into the show. But just to be clear, 500,000 people coming in over 12 months, which I think what the peak was, it's maybe down a bit now, but it's still a big number, puts a huge extra demand for housing and energy and water and infrastructure and schools and transportation, everything, which is stuff that we're not investing in. Our costs of energy are massively high and will go higher, probably. And so we've got this crazy situation where the migration lever is being pulled because it's the easy, simplistic lever, backed by big business. Why? Because big business sees this as a way of getting, one, cheap labor, and two, more people to sell more stuff to. But it doesn't make sense for an economy like Australia to keep pushing that immigration lever to the floor. And yet, Chalmers said recently, yeah, we're going to increase the migration thought process again. It's it's the only lever they've got, really, isn't it?
Yeah. So that was interesting. So last month, Treasurer Jim Chalmers basically upgraded Australia's. He said that the upcoming federal budget in a couple of weeks is going to it's going to upgrade the net overseas migration forecast for this current financial year and presumably going forward as well, right? The forward estimates by, I think it was about 15%. So in last year's federal budget, they forecast 260,000 net overseas migration for this current financial year that we're in. We've got data to the September quarter of last year, and it showed that we were tracking at about 311,000 net overseas migration. So it actually went up from the June quarter. So it's back on an upward trajectory. And Chalmers said it's going to be over 300,000 for this financial year in the budget. So that's an upgrade of about 15%. Now, interestingly, I've got a chart here just to show the impact of it. So listeners might remember that the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, and they're going to upgrade their report next year. So the latest State of the Housing System report came out in May last year. So it's almost a year old, and it's going to be updated soon. But the chart on the right, they actually showed that they projected that over the 5 years to 2028-29, which is the 5-year housing accord period that the federal government, this fantastical 1.2 million homes over 5 years, they forecast that based on the Centre for Population or the Treasury's population forecast, that Australia would have a housing shortage over the 5-year period of 79,000. So basically population growth would exceed housing supply or new housing supply. So that's housing supply ex demolitions. So additions to the housing stock by 79,000. Now, interestingly, this chart on the right came from the sensitivity analysis that's right buried at the back of the report, which of course I dug out straight away. And what it showed is that if population growth is 15% higher than the Treasury forecast, and bearing in mind, Treasurer Jim Chalmers has just upgraded net overseas migration by 15%, right? It forecast that instead of having a 79,000 shortage of homes over 5 years, we'd instead have a 200,000 shortage of homes over 5 years. So that's basically, if you look on the right-hand side of that chart, on the bottom right, you can see the baseline forecast, which is on the left, the bar on the left. And then next to that, it's got the high forecast. So that's high population growth, 15% higher than what the federal budget estimates. You can see that if we have high population growth, 15% higher, which is what Chalmers has basically said, we're going to have a housing shortage of 200,000 instead of 79,000. So this just tells you that Labor has, by running this massively mad immigration program, you can see the chart on the left shows the number of migrants per day under this government in the first 3.25 years of their reign. They've let in 1,145 net overseas migrants every single day. That's roughly double or almost double the previous two governments, right? So this is an insane amount and basically triple the Howard government, almost triple the Howard government, and about 4 times, more than 4 times the Hawke-Keating government daily net overseas migration. So Labor's continuing to run this mass immigration policy, and it's going to be strong. The budget's going to upgrade that to be about 15% higher than what they expected. And as a result, we're going to have a worsening housing shortage, according to their own advisor, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council. And it gets even worse than this, Martin, because basically a whole bunch of developers have come out and they've said that the cost of building homes is going to rocket now that we've got this energy crisis. So as we know, since the pandemic happened, we've had basically a 40% increase in construction costs. So that's obviously made it a lot more difficult to build homes. And as a result, the number of homes that have been built has crashed, right? And as the chart on the top left shows, it's from Justin Farbo, a whole bunch of builders have gone bust since the pandemic. And they've gone bust because they entered into fixed price contracts after the Morrison government implemented their housing stimulus, the home builder stimulus. A whole bunch of people rushed in to build homes. They signed contracts to build homes with developers. They were fixed price contracts. And then we had all the COVID related spike in construction costs. And construction costs have risen about 40% since the pandemic. And what that meant is that a whole bunch of home builders then went bankrupt and went under and became insolvent because they basically priced a home here, which they thought they could make a profit on, and then costs rose, and then they're making losses. Now, in the last few weeks, a whole bunch of home builders have come out and said because of this Middle East energy crisis, the cost of inputs has rocketed. So we're talking PVC pipe, concrete, masonry, all these things that go into building a home and also preparing land, etc., has all rocketed because of the rise in energy costs. And for example, Nigel Satterley, who runs Satterley Property Group, that's the second biggest house on land builder in the country. He came out about a week or so ago in the AFR, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and he forecast that the cost of building a new house on a house on land package is going to rise by $50,000 because of the Middle Eastern oil shock. And he said the cost of preparing a block alone has gone up about $20,000 because of the high diesel costs. And then you got to add all the PVC pipe, the cost of concrete's gone up, everything's gone up in cost. And as a result, he said that to build a typical house is going to cost $50,000 more. There was another developer called Daycorp. They basically said that feasible developments now become marginal, and marginal developments become unfeasible because of the rise in the Middle East, rising costs. There was a whole bunch of reports in the media about builders basically going to pull up stumps and leave the industry because the costs have gone up and they can't make a profit anymore. So what this tells you is that at the same time as Labor is basically ramping up immigration, projects 15% higher immigration than what they forecast last year, the supply side of the housing market is getting worse. It's going to get worse again because of this energy shock, which is going to just basically spike materials costs and make it more expensive to build homes. And when homes become more expensive to build, and we've got rising interest rates as well, obviously, you get less of them. So developers are getting squeezed twice, rising construction costs because of the energy crisis again. And then also we've got obviously the RBA's delivered 2 rate hikes. The financial markets tip 2 to 3 more by the end of the year, which just makes it even more expensive to develop. And also it's going to reduce demand for new homes because people can't pay as much because the borrowing capacity is being crimped. So we've got this perfect storm, especially for the rental market, whereby the construction is going to shrink at the same time as demand through immigration remains absolutely red hot. And this is just an absolute disaster. And I don't know if you want me to go straight onto it, but Louis Christopher came out with his latest rental data. And so this is why it's an absolute perfect storm. Higher immigration with less supply equals a worsening rental crisis. That's on top of a rental crisis that's already absolutely terrible. So according to Cotality, since the end of 2019, the median advertised rent in Australia has gone up by 48%. That's added about $11,700 to the annual cost of renting versus what it was at the end of 2019. So rents have risen roughly 3 times faster than wages, according to Cotality. Louis Christopher's latest rental vacancy data from SQM Research, that's shown on the top left, the national vacancy rate has fallen to 1%, which is basically close to, if not the lowest in recorded history. So the rental market remains super tight. You can see across the capital cities all the different rental vacancy rates. It's not quite as tight in Sydney and Melbourne, still very tight, but all the other capitals are absolutely tight as, below 1% rental vacancy rates. The charts on the right come from the latest weekly indicators from Cotality. So this literally came out today. And you can see that the number of homes for rent across the combined capital cities is, roughly, it's down about 40% from the pre-pandemic level. And in the last 12 months, the number of homes listed for rent has fallen across every single capital city. So across the combined capital cities, the number of homes listed for rent just in the last 12 months alone has fallen by 10% across the combined capitals, and it's down in every single capital city. So this just tells you that the rental crisis is going to get worse. So it's already at its tightest in, close to its tightest in living memory. So I doubt many people who are watching this would remember a time or live through a time that's worse than now for the rental market. So it's already in absolute dire straits. And then Jim Chalmers comes out and says, sorry, guys, immigration is going to be 15% higher than what we forecast last year. At the same time as all the developers are warning that because of the Middle East energy crisis, construction costs are about to surge even higher after going up 40% since the pandemic. And developers are now facing another wave of insolvencies. Supply is going to be even more constricted because of higher costs. It's going to be just too expensive to build homes at a price that people can afford. So this is just a perfect storm for the rental market. It's going to get worse if you're a renter than it already is, which is just absolutely absurd.
Yeah, and my latest survey data shows about 3/4 of households in the rental sector are under cash flow pressure. More are still being confronted with more rate rises. And of course, as interest rate rise, the investors are trying to actually claw back some of that extra cost. Insurance costs are also rising and other costs too. So it's a continuing process. And it shows you that there's a real structural problem here. And I guess if you want to sort of understand the dynamics and structural issues, we talked about migration. The other policy that the government rolled out last October was, hey, we're going to help first-time buyers get into the market. That's going to help the market to improve, isn't it? Well, didn't quite go according to plan, I think is probably the answer.
Yeah, so this is just another shock. I mean, hey, I'm from the government. I'm here to help. Another classic example, right? So Cotality did a great report last week. I've got the summary charts here, and what they basically did was, so Cotality, this 5% expanded deposit scheme has been out for six months now, right? So it came out October 1, and they did data to the end of March. So that's 6 months. So Cotality captured the impact over the first 6 months of this policy. So just a quick recap, if you're not sure what this is, basically from October 1, the federal government basically allowed, without any sort of income caps or anything, allowed all first home buyers to be able to purchase a home with a 5% deposit, and the government, i.e. taxpayers, would guarantee 15% of the loans. So the reason behind it was that previously, before this policy, first home buyers had to basically borrow, they had to have it come up with a 20% deposit if they wanted to avoid having to take out lender's mortgage insurance, which can cost like 20 grand. So the government said, look, we'll make it so that you can purchase with only a 5% deposit, and we'll guarantee 15%. Therefore, you won't need lender's mortgage insurance, blah, blah, blah. It's, it'll be an affordability measure, all this sorts of stuff. Now, there was the only checks on this policy was that there were price caps. So, for example, at Sydney, you had to buy a home that was under $1.5 million. Well, it's pretty high. Melbourne, 950,000, Brisbane, $1 million, Adelaide, 900,000, Perth, 850. So you can see it in the middle table there on the left-hand side. It's got the price caps. Now, what Cotality did, and this was great, they actually worked out the difference in price growth across all the markets below the price caps and above the price caps. And what it showed is at the national level, the growth below the price cap was 3.6%, which is about half what the growth was above the price cap. And in some markets, it was even, and that's the table on the left-hand side. And you can see across all the markets, the price growth below the price caps was significantly higher, or than the price growth above the price caps. And you can see, so obviously it's had a very stimulatory impact on at the affordable end of the market, the quote unquote affordable end, below the price caps. And in particular, in places like Sydney and Melbourne, it's had a very big impact. So Sydney, for example, above the price caps, in the 6 months to March, Sydney home prices fell by 1.1%, but below the price caps, they actually rose by 4.1%. So that's a massive difference. For Melbourne, above the price caps, they fell by 1% over the 6 months. Below the price caps, they rose by 1.6%. But across every single market, this policy basically led to higher home prices than would otherwise have been the case. So therefore, it failed as an affordability measure. So, for me, affordability is about making homes cheaper. This policy has made homes more expensive. And what it means is that if you fast forward 5 years down the track, or even a couple of years down the track, and you're a future first home buyer, all it means is that you will have to pay higher home prices than you would have without this policy to get into the market. It also means that then you will have to, for a lot of them, without this policy, they would have been able to purchase with the 20% deposit off their own bat, so they'd only be borrowing 80%. Instead, they'll have to pay a higher price. They'll have to take out this 5% deposit scheme, and they'll have to carry a much larger mortgage than they would have otherwise, which is going to lock them into a higher lifetime of debt. And the other interesting little tidbit out of this, Martin, is on the right-hand side. You can see that the run-up in house prices, which is shown in the pink, actually started before the policy came into effect. So the federal government announced it in, I think it was late August, and you can see the break in prices from late August. So as soon as the government announced this, basically prices started rising. Now, that's probably because investors front run it. So they thought, oh, beauty, this policy's coming in. I bet I should buy now before this policy comes into effect. So it's pushed forward demand from, say, investors to get in before the policy came in, because they knew as soon as the policy came in, prices were going to rise. So this policy has unambiguously stimulated home prices. But the more scary aspect, Martin, is that a lot of first home buyers who purchased under this policy would have purchased under the expectation that interest rates weren't going to rise, or they might have actually fallen. Because at the end of last year, there was still, a fair few people who thought the interest rates would at least be flat or might even fall. So some of them would have been suckered into this. They would have purchased, and then suddenly they've been smashed with back-to-back rate hikes. And now they're facing the prospect of 2 to 3 more rate hikes, if you believe the financial markets, which is just an absolutely, disastrous situation to be in. Because, especially if you purchase in Sydney and Melbourne, whereby prices are now falling. So Sydney and Melbourne home prices have fallen by 0.6% in the last 28 days, according to Cotality. I've got a chart here from Justin Farbo on the right-hand side. Actually, this came out today by him. You can see that Sydney and Melbourne home prices are basically in a correction phase now. So far this month, they're down by 0.6%. And obviously, the situation is getting worse. So if you're a first home buyer who borrowed big to get into the market in Sydney and Melbourne with a 5% deposit, you're facing the prospect in, say, 6 months' time of being in negative equity if prices fall for a decent amount of time. And that's not a good situation to be in. You're going to be paying more and more, mortgage interest, because we've had 2 rate hikes, potential for 2 to 3 more if you believe the financial markets, at the same time as you've got prices falling, and you're facing negative equity. And if the other capital city markets roll over and they start posting losses in a few months' time, say, in a quarter or 2, well, then some of those buyers are going to be potentially face negative equity down the track as well. So this has been a disastrous policy by the government to basically suck in a whole bunch of first home buyers into the market when they shouldn't have, at possibly arguably the worst time to be pulled into the market, at the very top of the market. And now a lot of those people who got sucked in are facing a massive rise in mortgage payments, as well as potential negative equity. So it's a very bad equation for them.
And 2 observations. The first one is, of course, because they only had a 5% deposit, they needed to borrow more, which means that the overall mortgage is bigger to start with. And banks, in some cases, charge them more for the bigger mortgage than normal. In my surveys, I saw a lot of people pulled forward by this, but they were already going to buy within the next 12 months. So it just bunched everything together. It didn't really tackle those who were facing deep unaffordability, because they were still not able to get in, because, of course, there are serviceability metrics that have to be used by the banks too. The second is there is now a liability sitting on the national balance sheet called what happens if house prices fall. Because if house prices fall and people start getting the dividend because unemployment rises and they drop below, who's going to fill that gap that was previously done by landlord's mortgage insurance? It's not the banks, it's the government. So the government has now created for itself an additional liability if in fact home prices do move down, which might give them pause for thought to say, well, sure, we can't allow that to happen. We've got to find other levers to try and push houses prices back up again. We know how that ends, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So we used to talk about the old in America they call it the Bernanke put. Remember that? Whereby the Federal Reserve would lower interest rates whenever there was some sort of housing correction or whatever. That was a view at the time. Well, now we've got the elbow put because the federal government now is on the hook, and they have directly encouraged a whole bunch of first home buyers into the market through their policy.
Yep.
So they are incentivized now to try and support the market, to support those people who they sucked into the market, and also to stop the contingent liability they've got now from backing all these mortgages from actually falling on the taxpayer. So in some ways, it's like it's created a this elbow put on the housing market, whereby the government is now going to be incentivized to support the market. But if they do support the market, that's going to be would you think other things equal would be more likely to lead the RBA to hike interest rates more?
Correct.
So it's kind of this tug of war that we've got between, So look, it's just appalling policy, but that's it's band-aids on top of band-aid stuff. It's not a real affordability measure, obviously, never was. You don't fix affordability by boosting demand, right? But for 25 years or so, that's what Australia has done with first home buyer grants, with shared equity schemes, with all sorts of handouts for whatever, all these different little subsidies of some kind or interventions by the housing market. They're always marketed as an affordability measure. But name me one time in the last 25 years that Australia's gotten more affordable housing from this. Everything's gone the other way. We've gotten less affordable housing. So this policy that came out in October was a shocker, and it's just going to lead to higher house prices than there otherwise would be, and bigger mortgages than there otherwise would be, and people basically becoming, mega mortgage slaves unnecessarily. Now, I'm obviously not putting all the blame on Australia's housing market on this one policy, but it's just another cherry on top of a whole bunch of policy failures we've had for 25 years.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? It's a compounding series of bad choices made by governments of both persuasions for the last 20 to 30 years. Because I can remember, around the year 2000, I started seeing the early signs of this going off the rails, because prior to that, housing affordability in Australia was okay. It wasn't great, but it was okay. But since then, we've had first home buyer grants. Then we had home builder, of course, which was more to solve problems for the construction sector, except that you can see how well that went. Yes, we saw it just earlier on, right? That blew up a whole lot of construction projects and firms. And then we've had the latest outings as well. And it seems to me that every time they try and solve one part of the puzzle, it's like, yeah, but what about the rest of it? What about the other end? It's completely unwieldy. And so you end up with more and more people effectively getting into more and more debt. Who benefits from that? Well, of course, the lending sector, the banks benefit. And so there's been a huge acceleration in mortgage lending. If you look back over the recent 20 to 30 years, more and more of the bank's revenue comes directly from the mortgage books. And in fact, there are more and more big building societies, less and less able to support small businesses, for example. And so the net effect of all that is you've got a greater concentration of the mortgage book sitting in the banks, plus the average duration of a mortgage in Australia continues to extend. So it used to be 20 years, now it's 25 years, 30 years, 35 years, and even longer in some cases. And so you've got a greater proportion of the population who are actually in greater debt. A greater proportion of their income is also now going to service the debt. And I've done some work recently, which will be coming out in the newspapers, I think, over the coming weekend, showing how it's now 45% of net disposable income in many areas just trying to service that mortgage. If you're the rental sector, you've got the same issue too. So you've got a greater proportion of households struggling under this massive weight of trying to pay for somewhere to live. That is one of the reasons why households are not spending as much as they might otherwise because they can't afford to, because they're trying to just spend to get somewhere to live. It's complete failure of policy over many years.
Yeah, and look, who'd want to be a young person right now, right? So you basically you've got to choose between paying, nosebleed level of home prices and taking on a mega mortgage. Who wants to do that? Or you're stuck in the rental market and the rents are surging. So it's just like, well, it's not a great situation, and I can understand why young people are pretty disillusioned. At the same time, those same young people often are the ones who are most likely to vote for higher immigration, etc. So often they're not they're often their own worst enemy. But yeah, look, I do have a whole bunch of sympathy for them.
Yeah, and it's worth, I think, saying that I understand that people desire to own a place to live. Now, I have many conversations, my one-on-one conversations, and it's different conversation if you're an investor versus an occupier. People desire to have safety and certainty and somewhere to live. And frankly, compared with being in the rental sector, for many, it's much, much better for them to hold somewhere to live. But when the opportunity to get on that opportunity, the lower level of the property ladder, it's not got many ladder rungs these days. It's a huge jump up. You can understand why people will extend and extend and extend to try and get on. And of course, the old theory was, well, once you're on the property ladder, then you can ride the property price growth. And we saw post-COVID property prices in some areas move 40% in a year or two. But that ain't normal. And my expectation is that we are not going to see significant price rises ahead. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, just on that point,
yeah,
if you don't mind,
yep.
interestingly, money.com.au, they did some modeling. It was some other firm they got to do some modeling on it. It was in the in the SMH or domain or whatever, published today actually. And what they showed is they're actually expecting their base case is for an 11% decline in capital city home prices. This is the chart on the left, by 2030. So they're actually picking a pretty decent sized housing correction. And they warned their worst case scenario, so this is what they expect, but this is if we get a sort of flood of supply, which seems unlikely, 3 rate rises, which, yeah, could be pretty likely, and also high unemployment. So actually it's probably, pretty likely that scenario to some degree. They forecast that we could even get a 40% price decline by 2030. So that's a chart on the left. So their base case is the yellow line, and the worst case scenario is the red line, and it could be anywhere in between those levels. They actually do an ideal case. I don't know, ideal for who. It's certainly not ideal if you're a first home buyer or you want to get in the market. But they say that if we get average supply, I don't know what that means, no rate rises and the same unemployment rate, which to me seems incredibly unlikely, that we're going to get no rate rises and the same unemployment rate over the next 5 years, we could have a 23% increase in prices, but their baseline is 11% decline. Now, some people go, oh, look, that's unlikely, whatever. But I put a chart on the right. This is from Justin Fabo, who released it, I think, last week. This is a series of upgrades every 6 months. And you can see that the two most similar countries to Australia, I'd argue, economically, and also housing markets, are New Zealand and Canada. And New Zealand and Canada, they've experienced roughly 20% declines in nominal house prices from their peaks. And that's the chart, and that's the line in the red is Canada, and the grey one's New Zealand. And so New Zealand and Canada have experienced very big declines in home prices. Well, what makes you think Australia couldn't do the same? Now, I'm not saying that we'll necessarily fall by that, but you've got to be a little bit concerned right now. And it should, at least, the fact that New Zealand and Canada, which New Zealand's got exactly the same banking system as Australia, right? It's got our big four banks, New Zealand's big four banks. Yes, a different structure of the economy, but Canada's economy is actually structurally pretty similar to Australia. Now, there are differences, obviously. New Zealand and Canada have had a big decline in net overseas migration, huge decline. Australia's is still going strong. Canada's also more sensitive to, obviously, the Trump tariffs and that sort of thing, which has smashed their economy, which we're not. But we have our own sensitivities with the energy market and, exposure to China and all that sort of stuff. So, there are obviously differences, but there's also enough similarities there for anyone who's watching this to be a little bit nervous, to go, well, if New Zealand and Canada, who also had massive house price rises, and everyone thought that bricks and mortar was as safe as bricks. housing was as safe as bricks, and they've had big housing corrections. Well, surely this tells you that it is possible for Australia to experience exactly the same. And which is why when you've got the most expensive home prices in history relative to incomes, after the latest two rate hikes, we've probably got the highest mortgage repayments, on record relative to incomes. We've got a very stretched market, right? It's incredibly stretched on every metric. Historically bad affordability. Well, then, and we've got rising rates. You've got to be a little bit nervous that we could follow Canada and New Zealand down a similar path, which is why if you're watching this, I'd be pretty nervous about gearing up into property. Extending yourself too hard to get for the fear of missing out, because you really are setting yourself up for risk. That's all. Whether we're in 12 months' time, we could have a chat and it might end up being a pretty mild downturn. We don't know. But I do often watch Canada and New Zealand as, potential canaries in the coal mine, because they're not that different to us, especially New Zealand, same banking system. And Canada, similar, probably a more similar economy in the way it's structured to Australia than New Zealand. And also Canada's similar in the way that most of Australia's population is on the East Coast, hugging the coast. Canada's is on the southern border, hugging the US. And they've got a few large cities and not much else. Bit like Australia, like a very centralised country. Both those countries have had very big housing corrections. And I'm sure people in those countries have probably said, oh, no, go back 3 years ago, not possible. House prices only go up. Well, now they haven't. And both of those countries have experienced very severe housing corrections, whereby prices, once you adjust for inflation, are down by about 30%. So this could happen to Australia. That's what I'm saying. And I think we're probably at the riskiest point in my lifetime for the housing market right now. Like I'd be, I'm more nervous about a correction now than I've ever been, based on everything that's happened. It's almost like a perfect storm right now.
Yeah, well, that's what we call the show, and we did it for a good reason, because I'm with you. Now, I've always been of the view that there was risks building in the housing market, and I started talking about that in 2000, and et cetera, et cetera. But every time the government pulled another rabbit out of the hat to be able to keep the scheme going again and again and again. But every time they've had to spend more money to do it, and it's shifted the gear further and further away from what I will call long-term normal. So that 40% drop that you saw, one of the scenarios, it's quite close to some of my scenarios, would be taking you back to what the long-term story for housing should be relative to income, right? Anything above that is a bit of a gift. And it's a gift perhaps because banks lend for longer and lend on higher multiples. It's interesting, CBA now uses 2 full-time incomes in their affordability calculation. Now, a few years ago, they didn't used to do that. So something has changed there in terms of the expectation now is that people will put 2 full incomes in to service the mortgage. So this is a long-term failure.
Yeah, and to your point, so there's a great chart here that Shane Oliver did. It's the top left, right? So, whenever we do these things, I put a whole bunch of charts. I'm not sure which one I'm going to use, but this is exactly to your point. Top left, Shane Oliver did this about a month ago, and it actually showed the gap between home prices and borrowing capacity. And so historically, home prices have kind of tracked borrowing capacity, not perfectly, but in this period since COVID, there's been a massive divergence in home prices and borrowing capacity. Now, there could be a whole bunch of reasons for that. So we've obviously had, the bank of mum and dad's been more active. Investors have been more active in the last couple of years as well. There's also been, we've obviously had incredibly high immigration, et cetera, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff. But ultimately, when you've got interest rates going back up, that blue line of borrowing capacity is going to fall, right? It's going to fall back down. And the gap between what should be affordable and what borrowing capacity actually is just getting wider and wider. And eventually those two lines have to close up. Now, they won't necessarily close up perfectly, but they can only do it in one of two ways. Either prices fall, so the red line falls to meet the blue line, or interest rates fall, so the blue line rises to meet the red line. ultimately one of those two things is going to happen or has to happen for those two lines to sort of come back together. Now, they don't have to meet perfectly because obviously they weren't meeting perfectly in, the late teens, but they were a lot closer than they are now, and they have to converge somehow. And if the RBA looks very likely to increase interest rates further in the period ahead, the financial market's tipping 2 to 3 rate hikes. Two's banked in and potentially three. So the sort of, I think 4.7 something by the end of the year is their pricing. And obviously 4.6 is two more rate hikes. So sort of, 2.5 is what they're pricing, thereabouts. So if that comes to fruition, well, that blue line's going to fall. And for those, which means it's going to be even further away from the red line. So that means that for them to converge, the red line's got to fall, which means prices got to fall. So this just tells you that, we're either going to get house prices falling or interest rates have got to be slashed for this affordability or for home prices to have any resemblance to capacity to pay. And it's just another reason why you got to be pretty nervous about the housing market right now, because the gap between affordability and prices has never been this wide. And it's like the jaws of death. The jaws are going to close eventually, somehow. And it doesn't look like rates are going to come down anytime soon. Well, they're certainly not going to be slashed. Now, I have said in a previous podcast, I still think that it could be pretty likely. We could get a few more rate hikes. And then similar to what happened in the global financial crisis, whereby when the US subprime mortgage crisis hit back in late 2007, when it first hit, the RBA kept hiking rates. They hiked rates 4 times in the next year. And then when the full-blown global financial crisis hit, which was in, I think, September 2008, Lehman Brothers went under and Bear Stearns went under. We had the full-blown financial crisis across the globe. The RBA was forced to cut, and it cut by, I think it was at 4%. It cut like 400 basis points. So it rose 100 basis points into the subprime crisis, and then it had to slash 400 basis points. Now, I'm not saying we'll do the same again, but I think something similar could happen. That's the chart on the right-hand side. The RBA could end up hiking, say 4 times. So we've already got 2, do 2 more. Then we get a big spike in unemployment because of the global energy shock and a whole bunch of other things happen. And then the RBA is forced to slash rates. Now, I don't think they'll slash down to 0 again, but we could end up getting a little bit of the RBA going, oops, we went too hard. We got to cut by 1%, maybe 1.5%, and we get interest rates getting cut again. I think that's pretty likely, but that probably wouldn't follow through till next year. So in the interim, we're going to get higher rates and I think house price declines by the end of the year nationally.
Yeah, and it's worth
probably the next few months, to be quite honest with you, because according to Cotality, the 5-city capital index is almost down to 0 now growth, because Sydney and Melbourne are dragging it down. But I think in a few months, that nationally is going to be in full-blown negative territory, and by the end of the year, we're going to be getting some pretty decent house price falls.
Yes, and the point here is these things could happen quite quickly, right? So if the unemployment starts to wobble up, as interest rates are rising, as banks tighten their lending, which they've already started to do for some investors, the other factor, of course, is this capital gains tax question or the negative leverage, etc. It's worth noting that peak, there was a tracking in that earlier chart that you showed there that actually, for a long period of time, the two were wobbling together, and then they started to break apart. Now, there was a deregulation of the financial system. There was the introduction of market securitization for mortgages, all of those things. But there was also changes to the tax on investment properties to make it more advantageous. And Alan Kohler has been one of the people saying, well, that was one of the reasons why we started to get this divergence. So I wonder whether it's coincidental or not that effectively we've now got a discussion going on about, well, should we reverse the CGT story and the negative gearing story? And, maybe that'll help the property market. I'm not so sure that it's going to have a huge impact. And I think it's a bit of a fig leaf for a bigger problem that they don't want to admit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it's going to have. I think CGT reform should definitely happen. Right, it's worth doing anyway for tax reasons, for budget sustainability reasons, for tax efficiency reasons, stuff like that. So personally, I quite like what I'm hearing at the moment. So what I've heard in the media, this is I don't have any special line to government or anything. Right? This is just what I've read on the AFR and all over the place. It looks like the government's going to go back to the pre-1999 capital gains tax method, which is very sensible, right? So the fact of the matter is the Howard government should never have changed the rules in the first place.
Yep.
We had a very good system that was basically, all it did was it taxed real capital gains. So what that meant is that if you held an asset for 10 years and it doubled in price, I'm just picking the numbers out for simplicity, right? So if you bought an asset over 10 years, it doubled in value, but inflation was 50% over that period, you basically paid tax on the nominal gain minus the CPI inflation increase. So you pay tax on the 50%. And it was a very good system. So it didn't tax capital better than wages. It basically only taxed you on the real wages, on the real gains after inflation. And you paid the full amount of tax. Now, there was also another provision whereby they let you average it as well. So basically, if you say made $500,000 capital gain over because you sold an asset after 10 years or 20 years or whatever, instead of that getting added to your taxable income straight up, they basically only added 1/5 of that to your taxable income, but then charge you 5 times the rate. I don't know if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense, but it's in my head. It makes sense. But what that meant is it didn't make your tax spike it didn't make it as lumpy on your tax. Now, it was actually a pretty good system, right? Because it wasn't distortionary. You're paying full capital gains, but you're only paying it on the after inflation component. It was very smart. And what it also did, so instead the Howard government came in and they said, you only pay 50% your marginal tax rate on the nominal gain, which was stupid because if you made a quick short-term capital gain, but you held it for, under both systems, you had to hold the asset for 12 months, right? But assuming that happened, it meant that if you made a quick gain, you could make massive, you could save a bunch of tax, right? So if you hold an asset for 2 years, it goes up 50%, beauty. You only pay, tax on 25% of that gain. And what it did was basically incentivize short-term speculation, but also punished you. If you held an asset for 20 years, you're actually worse off under the new system than the old system. Because over that 20-year period, you can't write off that huge amount of inflation that would have built up over that 20-year period because you do just get taxed at 50% the nominal gain. So it was basically incentivized short-term speculation and punished you if you held an asset for a very long time. Very stupid policy. And the reports are that the government wants to go back to the pre-1999 method, which is great. Now, personally, I think they should grandfather existing investors. Now, the reason for that is for simplicity, because if you grandfather existing investors, it actually won't cost the budget that much money, because if you're an existing investor and you've held your asset for, say, the average hold period, I'm guessing is probably at least 5 years, right? If you bring in this new pre-1999 system, and if you don't grandfather, well, the longer you hold the asset, the more you can write off your gains with inflation anyway. So the government's not going to get a whole lot more get a whole lot more budget revenue. So it's kind of a simple method. You just grandfather existing investors, bring in the pre-1999 method from, say, July 1 this year, and go from there. And it's going to apply to property, shares, everything. So we're just basically going to go back to the future, to the old system, which I think is brilliant. That's exactly what we should do. The property industry seems pretty happy about it. So the HIA has come out and said this is the least worst option. We've had this system before. It worked. Let's just go back to it. And to be honest with you, I'm all for it. And it gets rid of this whole problem of, investors getting these special perks through capital gains tax. Like you will get fully taxed, but you'll only get fully taxed on your after inflation returns, which is how it should be. So yeah, if they do that, I think it's a good thing. Now, in terms of the housing market, I don't think it's going to make much difference, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to crash the market. I don't think it's going to do much at all. It's going to be more efficient for a tax perspective. It'll save the budget some money over the long term, especially, in periods of low inflation. Now, we obviously don't have low inflation now, but it'll make the budget will make additional tax revenue. It'll reduce speculation, like short-term speculation. It'll reward people who hold assets for the long term, because the longer you hold it, the more you can write off your eventual gains with inflation that builds up over time. So yeah, it's a good policy.
Absolutely. But to put effectively that in the shop window as, well, we're solving intergenerational unfairness by doing this. Yeah, it is, the political messaging is completely disconnected from the reality, in my view.
Yeah, it's not going to do a lot. It's sensible from a budget perspective, from a tax efficiency perspective. It'll have some marginal impact on, it'll, I guess, take some of the speculative investment out of it a bit, not a lot, but it's not going to have a big impact. Let's be honest. It's not going to move the dial versus cutting immigration, which is what they should do. Because I've argued plenty of times, and I heard this argument on Punters Politics with a dude from the Australia Institute. Personally, the number one, one of the best ways to improve housing affordability is to simply cut immigration, because if you do that, you're going to have the biggest impact on the rental market. And we've seen that clearly with Canada. I've got some charts there I can show in a sec. But the fact of the matter is most first home buyers rent before they buy, right? So if you can make rents cheaper, it means that first home buyers can save up a bigger deposit because they're not spending as much money on rents. And then lower immigration also does put some downward pressure on prices. Now, it doesn't put nearly as much downward pressure on prices as it does on rents, because that home prices are set by interest rates, borrowing capacity. There's a whole bunch of factors, tax settings, all that sort of stuff. And immigration is just one input. The rental market, it's a pure supply demand play, right? So immigration has a direct impact on the rental market. So if you're a first home buyer, it's a double whammy. You can spend less on rent because you got lower immigration than you would otherwise. So you can save a deposit quicker. That helps you. And then also put some downward pressure on price as well. So so you benefit twice. If you change tax settings like negative gearing and capital gains tax, you don't improve the rent situation, right? So you're not saving money in your rent. You still got the same problem there because the government's running a high immigration policy and we've got constricted supply. But all you're doing is getting a little bit of downward pressure on prices, not even a lot. So you only get one benefit there versus cutting immigration, get two benefits, lower rents and lower prices, versus the switching the negative gearing capital gains tax. You're only getting the price impact and it's only small anyway. So personally, if the government wants to help first home buyers, and to be honest with you, when we talk about housing affordability, we talk about two things. We talk about rental affordability for people who are renting, and we talk about purchase affordability for first home buyers on the purchase side. Nobody cares how much a house is for someone like me who's already got a house, because you sell and buy in the same market, right? Affordability doesn't apply to us. It applies to someone who doesn't have a home already and who wants to purchase. So when we talk about housing affordability, we're talking about two things: the rental market, rental affordability, and first home buyers for purchasing. That's all it is. The rest of it's irrelevant. And immigration impacts the rental market directly. So it impacts rental affordability directly, and also helps first home buyers directly because they pay less rents while they're saving up for a deposit and looking to buy. And then when they purchase, there's a little bit of downward pressure on prices because of lower immigration. So it's a double whammy. And whereas negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions basically have zero impact on the rental market. So you're not helping renters, you're only marginally helping first home buyers, versus cutting immigration helps renters and helps first home buyers.
Absolutely. It's really important that people understand that dynamic, I think, because, the truth is this can have a profound impact if people understand how these things work. But actually, nobody really wants to admit that it's the migration story that is actually ultimately the thing that's driving so much else. And all the other government policies that are sort of around the end are sort of trying to sort of stop the effect of the migration policy flowing through, but not effectively. And that's the problem, really. I mean, New Zealand and Canada, it's all there, isn't it? If you want a case study.
Oh, yeah. And Canada is the best one. So I've got some great charts here in Canada. So this came out a couple of weeks ago. And, so Canada, their latest population data came out, I think, late last month. And it showed that Canada actually lost 100,000 residents last year so what happened was, after the pandemic, Canada had an absolute explosion in immigration. You can see that chart on the left. That's not immigration, it's population growth. But you get the idea. A bit like us, they had an absolute ramp up in immigration, unprecedented. And in early 2024, Canada had an extreme surge in rents, a rental crisis, record low rental vacancy rates, similar to what we've got now. And their government, they were under political pressure. They decided to basically bring in effectively a 3-year population freeze. So what they did was they cut the permanent migrant intake by 25%, but more importantly, they decided to manage down the stock of temporary migrants, so they call them non-permanent residents over there, from a peak of 7.6% in, I think, May 2024, to a policy goal of reducing the stock of temporary migrants in the country down to 5%. And currently they're down to about sort of 6 point something. And they want to reduce that to 5% of the population by 2027, I think it is. So anyway, so they did that by cutting back on student visas, worker visas. They're trying to get rid of dodgy asylum seekers, send them back home, etc. Like just basically tightening up the migration system. And what it did was it actually led to Canada's first population decline outside World War II, since World War II, in the year to September last year. Not year to September, last calendar year. So 2025. They actually lost 100,000 people, and you can see that represented a 0.25% reduction in population. That's the chart on the left. And since these immigration curbs came in and Canada's population growth crashed, Canada has experienced 18 consecutive months of rental declines. That's the chart on the top right. You can see 18 consecutive months. The chart below that shows average asking rent across Canada is now tracking at a 35-month low. It's down more than 8% from, I think, the May 2024 peak. And the decline in rents in Canada because of the decline in immigration and now negative population growth is saving the typical Canadian tenant $2,320 per year in rents. Now, this just shows you straight up that if you cut immigration, you're going to have improving rental affordability. You're going to have lower rents, and rental affordability is going to improve. Like this is Canada is almost the carbon copy of what Australia did post-pandemic. They had a massive surge in immigration. Theirs was actually bigger than ours, but they had a huge surge in immigration. They had the biggest rise in rental growth in pretty much history in Canada. They had record low rental vacancy rates because of this surge in immigration. The difference is their government did something about it. Right? They have directly chosen to cut immigration, cut the permanent migrant intake by 25%, and they want to reduce the stock of temporary migrants or non-permanent residents, what they call them, from 7.6% down to 5%. They're on the way to doing that. And as a result, Canada's population recorded their first yearly decline since Second World War. And again, 18 consecutive months of declining rents to a 35-month low. That there, Mark Carney, he came out to Australia a month or so ago. He should be tapping the elbow on the shoulder saying, look what we did. Why don't you do the same? Right? This is a no-brainer. If Canada can do it, and the thing is, the Canadian government they're called the Liberal Party. That's actually the equivalent to the Labor Party. So in Canada, they got the Liberal Party is the left party, centre left, and the Conservatives are basically the coalition equivalent. So they have a centre left government which chose to cut immigration, has basically in the process of solving its rental crisis, whereas our centre left government in Australia continues to run a absolutely absurdly high immigration program into a supply constricted market and continues to basically put Australian tenants into misery with record low vacancy rates and rents that have increased by 48% since the end of 2019. That's added, according to Cotality, $11,700 to the annual cost of renting. Like, what is our government doing? They have a direct carbon copy over there in Canada, which was a high migration country, left-leaning, government, which decided to do something about it. And our left-leaning bozos in Canberra, the Albanese government, is doing the complete opposite, into a supply shock. And that's why we've got a rental crisis. Like, we are ruled by absolute clowns, unfortunately.
Yeah, I fear you're right there. And, there are some clear stories for people who want to see. New Zealand is another example, but Canada is the one, the analog, I think, for all the reasons you've said. Leith, we've pretty much run out of time, but I think we've gone through the main issues. You and I both think that we are facing into a potential storm for the property market for all the reasons we've said. Bad policy, high immigration is still bubbling around in the background, but all the other factors, the oil crisis and everything else, the Middle East, all those factors, high interest rates probably will play in. So it'd be very fascinating to track this over the next little while. I might get you back on after the budget, and we might parse what the budget actually said and how that is read into what's going forward. But as we close the show, if people want to know more about what you do, where do they go?
Yeah, okay. So there's two spots. So there's macrobusiness.com.au. That's where I write daily on all these sorts of issues, cover a whole bunch of stuff. That's sort of the mothership. I've also got a YouTube channel. Just search my name. The YouTube channel is called Leith van Onselen. So, pretty easy. Where, I do upload all my media interviews. I do a weekly podcast now with Catherine Cashmore called The Macro and the Mortgage, which just talks about all these sorts of issues. And it just goes through the news of the week, the data of the week, etc. And we end up just riffing a bit like we are now. Just those two places is pretty much the places to get me. Coming up, I'm going to fly to Sydney. More than likely, it's not fully confirmed, but I'm going to be on the Carl Stefanovic podcast to talk the budget with Carl, and it's going to be, I think it's me, David Pocock, and Clive Palmer. So and Carl Stefanovic. So that should be fun. So that'll be sort of a post-budget wrap. Whereby we'll go through the budget, that sort of thing. So that's kind of what's coming up and coming. But those are two places: macrobusiness.com.au and at Leith Vo or Leith van Onselen on YouTube.
Leith, thank you so much. Always hugely insightful and backed, of course, by data. That's the point about this show in particular. We get into the detail and people can see how the arguments are developed. So I appreciate that. I'll look forward to getting you back on my channel. I might even see if I can get you to come on the 19th. The budget's on the 12th, right? So the following Tuesday will be the 19th. If you're free for that, we might get you back on then, because I'd love to be able to get your debrief on the budget and also perhaps get your experience of being on the Carl show as well. That could be quite fun too. But thank you very much indeed. I'll take you offline now and I'll close the show.
No worries. Thanks, Martin. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. So there you go. I hope you found that insightful. Thank you very much also to those who supported us via Super Chats. Really do appreciate that. It really helps to cover some of the costs of what we do here. We go out of our way to try and get into the real meat of the issue. So thank you for your support, all your comments as well. The dogs are still here, I think. Let's have a look. Where are the dogs? Dogs. Yep, the dogs are still here. Luna's sort of spilled out a bit, as they sometimes do. There you go. Believe it or not, she likes living in small beds, but occasionally wants to stretch out. Just to say that next week, Damien Klassen will be back and we'll talk about the markets and look to the impact of the Gulf War and what's happening there. So that'll be an interesting conversation. And I hope that you can join us for that. Check out our other recorded shows. We try to put shows out every day. And of course, at the moment, there's so much to cover. So there will always be new content on the channel. Thank you very much for the support this evening. Thanks for all the super chats. Thanks for the comments. Please like and subscribe. Take care. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next time. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Take care.